Melissa Pineda, and today I will be discussing two books on Kurt Cobain. I've decided to combine both into this review because they're both written by the same author. One is a biography on Kurt Cobain, and the other is a book looking at the lasting effects and impacts Kurt Cobain had on the music industry, the fashion industry, and different causes like feminism and mental health. Now, before I begin, if there's anything you hear that you find interesting or that you like, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. The two books I will be discussing today are Heavier Than Heaven, which was written by Charles R. Cross in 2001. So this is a very thorough and detailed biography of Kurt Cobain's life and his death. And the second book is also by the same authors. And Here We Are Now, The Lasting Impact of Kurt Cobain. And this was written in 2014. And Mr. Cross actually passed away last year in 2024. Cross was an American music journalist, author, and editor based in Seattle. And what was really neat is that Cross conducted over 400 interviews, and he was also granted exclusive access to Kurt Cobain's private journals and materials. So it's really like the most in-depth book and biography that you could read on Kurt Cobain. So why listen to my review of these two books? Well, because I'm going to tell you all sorts of random things about Kurt Cobain, things that you may know, and probably a few things that you may not know about him and his life, his troubled upbringing, and who he was as a person, and how he decided to end his life at such an early age as well. And he wasn't just the frontman for Nirvana. He impacted an entire industry and really an entire decade and beyond. So I mean, people are still discussing Nirvana. I mean, I still see people in Nirvana shirts. I see people's kids in Nirvana shirts. So Kurt Cobain, Nirvana's frontrunner, was born in 1967 in Aberdeen, Washington, and he died in 1994 at the age of 27. So from a very young age, Cross depicts Cobain as a very creative child, very creative, very empathetic, very sensitive, and troubled. And he lists a variety of reasons why this could have been the case. Like, he grew up with parents that ended up separating, which played a huge role, obviously affected him very much as a kid. So Kurt Cobain grew up really poor. He grew up with a family that, I mean, every family has their own issues, but there are a lot of suicides in his family, a lot of mental health issues in his family, alcoholism, parents that split up. So there are many ways you could read into why Kurt Cobain had mental health issues, or it could have been none of these things. He had chronic stomach issues too, which later led him to trying drugs almost to relieve the pain. And it's interesting because Cross describes Cobain as someone that was called a junkie before he had even tried drugs. So it was just, I guess, the image he had, the look, people misinterpreted it and thought, yeah, no, this guy is super skinny. A lot of it had to do with his stomach issues. Apparently he couldn't even keep food down. He often didn't. Apparently didn't brush his teeth, didn't like vegetables, and really, really loved Kraft dinner. So people had this image of him, and he sort of just went with it. You know, yeah, okay, well, they're gonna think I do drugs. Yeah, I'll roll with it. And that's sort of Kurt Cobain and how he was. But I mean, he did eventually end up being a drug addict, and it was argued by Cross that a lot of the drugs initially anyway was to dull the pain, numb the pain that he had in his head, but also with all of his stomach, chronic stomach issues. Apparently he was always cold. He would actually wear long johns to the beach. And Cross says that darkness was part of Kurt Cobain's lyrical gift. What I found really interesting in this book is that there's like this dichotomy between, okay, Kurt Cobain was always writing in his journal, always writing things. And in some of his journals, he would write how he wanted to die young. He wanted to kill himself after becoming a famous musician. He always had a knack for drawing and for creating, and he loved guitars and he loved music. And it's interesting because in these journals, he would write on one hand how he wanted to die young and famous. And on the other hand, he would write in his journals about almost like what A lot of great motivational speakers and mental health practitioners argue is that you should visualize your success and visualize how you'll deal with your success. Like write down an interview. This is what Kurt Cobain did. He would write down interviews he would have and how he would answer these questions on like how he became successful and what he was doing as a successful musician. So he had all these visualizing techniques where he foresaw he would manifest essentially his future, and he did. He became as famous as he pretended to be years before in his journals. But it's like he's manifesting all of that success. He's writing about being successful, and then he's also writing, on the other hand, about how when he becomes successful, he's going to kill himself. So Kurt Cobain talked a lot about suicide growing up. As a young teen, really, preteen, he would talk about it. And then when he was about 14, according to Cross, he really started talking about suicide, and he actually killed a cat at one point. And a lot of his drawings and writings in his journals were like super disturbing. Okay, so Kurt Cobain left home, so he was kind of passed around among family members after his parents split up when he was a child. So he lived with his dad, lived with his mom, his grandparents, I think like an uncle, and then he was finally on his own. He lived on the street, actually. He was homeless at the age of 17, and then he became a born-again Christian at 17 as well. It was only temporary. Like, Kurt Cobain was always searching for something. And Kurt Cobain had a band for years before actually naming it Nirvana. So it was named various things before Nirvana, and he settled on that name because he was a self-proclaimed Buddhist at that time. Cross talks about just the intense mental health struggles that Cobain had, from talking and writing about suicide to just the way he lived in terms of cleanliness. His apartment, like, he would steal headstones from graveyards. And he was obsessed with dolls and making them really disturbing and having them all over his apartment and writing on the walls and just living in complete filth and disorder and chaos. And I mean, clearly what was being experienced externally is what he was experiencing inside and internally as well. Unfortunately, his life was cut so short at 27. So Dave Grohl from the Foo Fighters was a band member, and he and Kurt Cobain actually lived together for a while. He was really only rich and famous for a very short period of time before he killed himself, and he barely had a chance to enjoy that wealth, and he always felt guilty about it too. So Cross talks about when Cobain actually had money, he almost always had a poor mentality, like a scarcity mentality of not having enough money and being worried about not having enough money when he was a millionaire, and then buying a brand new Lexus and returning it that day because he couldn't stomach having a luxury vehicle and what that would mean for his image, for instance. And I don't even know if he was so concerned about what other people thought of his image. It was his own image and what he thought of his own image and himself. And he didn't feel real or authentic, so he returned the luxury vehicle and just kept driving around in a beater. He had a very tumultuous relationship with Courtney Love, of course, and they had a baby. He and Courtney Love had drug addictions and mental health issues, and apparently Kurt Cobain had gone to the hospital when the baby was born and talked about how, he had a gun with him, and talked about how they should just both kill themselves because there was talk of the baby being taken away by child services. Reading both of the books on Kurt Cobain, I was borderline depressed reading these books. It was just so sad to read the turmoil that existed in Kurt Cobain's head and in his life, and obviously knowing how it was going to end too. So it's not like I was reading a book, hoping for the best. I already knew it was going to happen. So the second book, the Here We Are Now book, which was written in 2014, discusses like the lasting impacts of Kurt Cobain. And so we know he killed himself with a gun. His body was found a couple days later, and Courtney Love was criticized for this, but she was out looking for him. He would do drugs and no one would know where he was, or he'd go out in search of drugs, no one would know where he was. So she apparently was looking for him, and he was in the upstairs compartment of the garage, almost like a greenhouse in their home, and he had killed himself, and then they found his body 3 days later. The lasting impacts that were just fashion, music industry, his music was just completely new and novel at this time when it came out. Cross talks about how Kurt Cobain just actually couldn't afford clothes. Like, he had one pair of jeans, he wore his only plaid shirt, and he'd shop at thrift stores, and that was just part of who he was. So even when he became rich, it was still this scarcity mindset, this poor mindset where, well, I'm not gonna wear, you know, Louis Vuitton or luxury clothes when I'm just used to wearing what I wear. And he would wear the same clothes and sleep in them, and he's been wearing it for 3 days, and then he'd perform in it on stage. But it became cool. Grunge became cool, and on the runway you'd see people wearing what Kurt Cobain was wearing, and it was just funny because, like, he was wearing that because that was who he was authentically. And then you have, you know, these fancy designers replicating Kurt Cobain's wardrobe for thousands of dollars. Sometimes he would wear a dress on stage, which is interesting, and he was a huge supporter of feminism and basically of the way Cross described it as all the outcasts. So at that time, I mean, totally different now in society, but at that time, being gay was not celebrated openly, was not talked about, was more taboo. And so Kurt Cobain really spoke for those people, for the marginalized, for the outcasts of society. Or he was a strong supporter of women, especially of his wife too, Courtney Love, a fellow musician and artist. And just a little side note, something interesting, is Smells Like Teen Spirit, his huge hit, actually was called after a deodorant. There's a deodorant brand in the United States called Teen Spirit. So that's just something else I learned that you may not have known. I learned. So right after his death, a huge discussion took place on television, on the radio, and Courtney Love played a huge role in this, and a lot of people started talking more and more about this. It started to become less taboo and something that people talked about because it was a real problem that was being recognized. And Kurt Cobain was one among many great musicians that ended their lives early. I believe it was Kurt Cobain's mom that told him, it was definitely a family member, I think it was his mom that told him to not join the 27 Club. And for those of you not familiar with this, it's basically artists, musicians primarily, that have killed themselves at the age of 27. So people in this club: Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Brian Jones, Amy Winehouse, Robert Johnson, among others. And it's interesting because there are so many tortured artists, tortured souls that create absolutely incredible artwork, and Kurt Cobain is certainly among those people. So I'm gonna leave it there. These are really hard books to read just because it was sad, you know, reading about someone's life that was cut short, and he definitely had a lot of talent. And if there's anything that you've liked or found interesting, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. I've provided the links in my description on these books where you can find them. Thanks for listening. Until next time.